In my last lecture, I totally indulged in my so-called man crush. So the lecture's title on YouTube, Italian Baroque Painting, is actually a little misleading. Caravaggio was not the only Italian Baroque painter. Many of Caravaggio's contemporaries actually preferred Carracci, this over-the-top ceiling painting filled with sex scenes, allegory, and trompe-l'oeil techniques was painted for the cardinal who would become Pope Paul III. It's not one of our required works, but the illusionistic ceiling of Il Gesù is. Go for Baroque indeed. Artemisia Gentileschi, on the other hand, followed Caravaggio's example with dramatic tenebrism, open compositions, and an unflinching interest in violence. You remember her personal history, don't you? I think it's intriguing that women painters so frequently painted themselves in the act of pursuing their craft. We're going to see another couple of examples in this and the next unit. We know from her letters that Artemisia Gentileschi fought prejudice against women painters and struggled to get paid fully for her work. But in the end, she actually achieved a level of professional acceptance that eluded the bad boy Caravaggio. Grand Duke Cosimo de' Medici became a major patron, so did King Charles I of England. I'm actually surprised that none of Artemisia Gentileschi's paintings made the list, but you may recall that one of her Judith paintings did show up among the College Board questions, asking what identified her as a follower of Caravaggio. That question will reappear on this unit test. Speaking of Charles I, this is another old AP favorite that didn't make the cut, but I'm going to use it as a segue to the painting of Flanders and Spain, and more specifically the works of Peter Paul Rubens and Diego Velázquez. Both were Catholic painters of the Counter-Reformation, but more importantly, at least for interpreting our required works, they were both court painters, employed to portray and reinforce the authority of Catholic monarchs. Remember that this isn't just the age of religious wars. The 17th century also witnessed the rise of nation-states with absolutist monarchs who had the motivation and the resources to commission works that celebrated and reinforced their power and authority. Anthony van Dyck was a Flemish painter who trained under Rubens and followed him into royal service. Charles I was the King of England best known for getting his head chopped off during the English Civil War, which was part of the European religious wars. So, you've written about power and authority before. How does Van Dyck glorify his subject and show he knows who's just paying the bills? Well, there are the fancy clothes and the regal stance, of course, and that very arrogant glance at the viewer. But notice, too, how the low horizon line puts the emphasis of the painting on the king and shows him towering over the land that he rules, that stretches out behind him. On to the first of today's Baroque superstars, Peter Paul Rubens. Rubens was a classically educated humanist scholar, shades of Albrecht Dürer. He was also a diplomat who was knighted by both Philip IV of Spain and Charles I of England. Although his father was a Calvinist, Rubens was raised a Catholic in Flanders, which itself was a Catholic bastion of the Holy Roman Empire. Rubens traveled to Venice as a young man, where he was deeply influenced by Titian and Caravaggio's paintings. He also studied Greek and Renaissance sculptures, and like so many Baroque artists, he was blown away by our old friend, the Laocoon. So here we see Rubens' Baroque Descent from the Cross, which you've already encountered, next to Titian's High Renaissance Entombment, which I didn't include in your group exercise. What similarities and differences do you observe? Well, both painters use deep, rich colors and employ light for emphasis. Rubens was also influenced by the way Titian's looser brushstrokes captured the play of light, as you see in this detail of a cloak on the left. I couldn't find a comparable detail for the Descent from the Cross, and my efforts to blow up the painting just produced a blur. But take a look at the hair of the woman on the right, one of Rubens' famous well-endowed females. And of course, that's another similarity with Titian. They both loved to paint female flesh, although Rubens' nudes tended to have a lot more of it. But note that the composition of the works is quite different. The twisting figures and the diagonal line of Rubens' deposition clearly mark it out as a Baroque work. And here on the right, you see Caravaggio's Entombment. So what similarities and differences do you see between these two paintings? You should have talked about this before. Both paintings employ a diagonal composition, but Rubens' colors are brighter and his chiaroscuro is not as sharply defined as Caravaggio's. I don't actually think I'd apply the term tenebrism to Rubens' painting, in spite of that dark and stormy sky. We actually know that Rubens deeply admired this particular painting by Caravaggio since he painted a copy of it, which now hangs in the National Gallery of Canada. I think it makes for a fascinating comparison of the two painters' styles. I can't help but wonder if the hair color change was its own kind of homage to Caravaggio, because the ordinary people that Rubens would have encountered on the streets in Northern Europe would have had, for the most part, lighter hair. The Rubens painting that the College Board chose for the list is not, however, one of his counter-Reformation religious paintings, but instead one of a series of 24 paintings that Rubens made for a political patron. 21 of them are actually the cycle itself. The patron in this case was the former queen and regent of France, Marie de Medici. So let's watch a short video clip that talks about political painting in the Baroque era and shows several of the works from this series. I will tell you this is a somewhat older video. I think you've seen segments from it before, but it's very well done. So let me give you a little historical background. Marie de Medici was the wife of Henry IV of France, and he was himself one of the most interesting figures in this stormy historical era. A Protestant or Huguenot, Henry fought two other Henrys, it's actually called the War of the Three Henrys, over who would have the right to rule France. Henry IV won, but only after converting to Catholicism to persuade Catholic Paris to accept him. He famously, allegedly said, "Paris is worth a mass." Well, Henry IV needed a Catholic wife, and Marie de Medici came well connected to the Roman hierarchy. You recognize the last name. Henry IV was assassinated in 1610, and Marie became regent for her young son, Louis XIII. She wasn't a great ruler. The chaos that Henry IV had suppressed returned, but she fought hard to stay in control of France, and she was a great art patroness. Eventually, her son, with the help of his minister Richelieu, who really ran France, banished her from the court. Marie and Louis reconciled a few years later, and she remodeled the luxurious Palace of Luxembourg to hold these paintings, which were part of her propaganda effort to regain political influence in France. It didn't work. By the way, in 1631, Louis XIII banished her again, this time from France, and she died in exile. Now, Marie de Medici had the money to pay her bills, so Rubens took the job, but the cycle presented some artistic challenges. Marie de Medici wasn't nearly as interesting or important as she wanted to portray herself, especially on this many canvases. So Rubens really had to stretch to elevate her status, mostly by painting the queen hanging out with lots of mythological figures. In the painting on the left, which has showed up on past AP tests, Marie de Medici is arriving in France from Italy. A personified France kneels below her, and we also see three sea nymphs and the god of the seas celebrating her arrival. They're holding the ship steady so that she can disembark safely. In the felicity of the Regency on the right, Maria is shown in allegorical fashion as the personification of justice itself, and flanked by a retinue of some of the primary personifications or gods in the Greek and Roman pantheon. Back to our required work. I trust you watched the Khan Academy podcast about this work. I'm not going to repeat all of our experts' excellent points. There's a little truth behind all this Gopher Baroque mythological allegory. The king did receive portraits of his future bride, and on the right you see one portrait of a young Marie de Medici that survived, and I think looks a little bit like the one in the Rubens painting. But the king was not immediately smitten. He was, in fact, very smitten with his mistress of the time. He was also caught up with affairs of state, according to a Khan Academy essay on the painting that I didn't assign, believe it or not. When Henry IV's advisor announced that his marriage contract had been finalized, Henry exclaimed, quote, "By God, let it be. There is nothing to be done about it, because for the good of my kingdom and my peoples, you say I must be married, so I simply must be." Does not sound like the eager bridegroom portrayed, but Rubens, who knew who was paying for these portraits, pulls out all the stops. Jupiter and Juno, not actually a famously happily married couple, but we won't go there here, accompanied by their symbols, the eagle and the peacock, look down benevolently at Henry in the portrait of his future wife. The ancient gods of marriage and love, Hymen and Cupid to the left and right, hover in midair as they present this portrait to Henry IV, the King of France. The flaming torch in Hymen's hand symbolizes the ardor of their love. The painting is not especially subtle about the benefit that Marie de Medici is expected to bring to the marriage. Henry IV at the time was almost 50, and he had had no children by his former wife. The marriage had been annulled. His mistresses, by the way, had produced quite a few kids, but they didn't count. He needed an heir, and Marie did, in fact, give him 6 children, arguably her biggest political accomplishment. Let me share a couple more interesting comments I picked up when I was researching this painting. Note that the only figure in the entire work who stares out at us directly is Marie de Medici herself through her self-portrait. So the painting draws our initial focus to her. What makes this interesting is that artists, particularly in this period, much more frequently portrayed female figures as objects to be gazed at. Usually the focus and the power went to the male figures in the painting. So, does this mean Rubens was a closet feminist, or, and this would be my guess, was he pleasing the lady who paid the bills? Also, what do you notice about the personification of France, which I've blown up on the right? It's rather ambiguous when it comes to gender, isn't it? France is traditionally personified as a woman, Marianne. The 19th century painting on the left is a required work that we'll study in our next unit, and that's France. But in this painting, that is, in Rubens' painting, France takes on a rather androgynous role. She looks to be simultaneously a woman and a man. She has breasts, but look at those powerful exposed legs, the boots, and the masculine stance. They all suggest a male Roman soldier, or maybe too much time looking at paintings by Michelangelo. Anyway, whatever France's gender, the obvious intimacy between France and the king suggests that not only are the gods in favor of the match, so are the people of France. I've copied the personification of France from the painting of Marie de Medici arriving in France, rather confusingly into the bottom middle of this slide. Note that in this one, France looks more clearly male. Maybe that's because France in that painting is shown admiring Marie de Medici, not chatting with Henry IV. Wouldn't want him to be talking to other girls, would we? Okay, confession time. I'm really not a huge Rubens fan. No man crush here. But I really like this painting. It's the one I would have put on the list if they'd made me a member of the College Board ruling junta. They didn't. I've already mentioned that Flanders remained under Spanish Habsburg rule and also remained loyal to the Catholic Church. Rubens was not only a court painter, he was also a diplomat. He tried unsuccessfully to negotiate a peace between Catholic Spain and Protestant England in hopes that England would stop helping the rebellious Dutch. His diplomatic efforts didn't succeed, but Rubens got a front row seat for the horrors of war, and he had a personal stake in bringing them to an end. He was, frankly, more successful with art propaganda than he was with diplomacy. So this is another allegorical painting. I think it's moving and dramatic. So we see Europe flinging up her arms in despair. We see figures representing the arts being trampled. The Fury Electo, representing the horrors unleashed by war, appears almost demented. That's the hair flying on the diagonal on the right. So this is vintage Rubens. We see the extreme sense of movement, the dramatic and rather light use of color, sometimes described as coloristic, the very full-figured ladies, the use of mythological symbols and figures. Rubens is, if you'll pardon a little punning, ripe for an attribution question. Okay, I need to move on, but let me make one more point about Rubens, and this is something I could really imagine showing up on the test. Rubens ran his studio as a veritable painting factory. He employed a large workshop of assistants. They would do much of the actual painting, following oil sketches and detailed drawings that Rubens provided. He would supervise their work to a greater or lesser extent. It seems to have depended a lot on how much money he was getting paid for the painting. Rubens made changes where he thought they were necessary, and he finished off all but the very cheapest productions with the touch of his own hand. This is why Rubens' paintings, especially the large-scale ones, often vary pretty widely in quality. Rubens, by the way, considered people to be his specialty, but he often turned to others for help with, for example, plants and animals. I didn't know this until I was researching for this podcast today, but one of Rubens' closest friends and collaborators was our old buddy Bruegel the Elder, that is. In this painting, Rubens apparently painted Adam, Eve, and the horse, and he left most of the plants and animals to Bruegel, and they both signed the work. So I didn't know about this before. I owe my students a debt of gratitude for the opportunity and excuse to keep geeking along. Okay, we're off to Spain. In my first lecture for this unit, I talked a little about El Greco and even less about 16th century Spain. In geopolitical terms, however, the 1500s, the 16th century, was Spain's golden age. Spain had evicted the Moors, conquered much of the New World, and under King Philip II, that's the son of Charles V, spent its newfound wealth building magnificent monuments, buying and commissioning art, and fighting Protestants all over Europe. While the gold from the New World brought runaway inflation, the religious wars depleted Spain's treasury without obliterating Protestantism or even preserving Spanish rule over the Netherlands. Rather ironically, it was the 17th century, the 1600s, the years of decline, that would bring the greatest flowering of Spanish painting. Philip IV was Philip II's grandson. His court painter, and among the greatest painters of the Baroque era, was Diego Velázquez. Velázquez did the best he could with some rather unpromising material. Philip IV had a particularly exaggerated form of the Habsburg chin. The painter basically steals our attention away from that unfortunate face by painting the king's elegant clothing in superb detail. So here's a famous work by Velázquez that doesn't portray royalty or show up on our list, but whose influence do you see? I warned you, the answer so often turns out to be Caravaggio. So what Caravaggio elements can you identify? Well, the central figure looks rather like one of Caravaggio's sensual boys, but we also see the theatrical spotlighting, the pronounced chiaroscuro, the open construction that spills off the canvas. On the other hand, the tenebrism is a little less pronounced, a little more like Rubens' modulated chiaroscuro. And while this is a mythological and not a biblical scene, it seems to me that here again we have the world of the gods dropping down into the lives of ordinary people. But actually there's a little mystery here. Is Bacchus really there? Or are these partiers so inebriated that they think one of their fellow partiers is really a god? Velázquez loves to play with this kind of ambiguity, really to mess with our minds. And as we'll see when we get to Las Meninas, our required work. But first, a history painting. Here we move from a quasi-genre scene to the formal paintings of nobility that became Velázquez's trademark and paid his bills. This painting, which you saw in your homework reading, commemorates a Spanish victory over the Dutch. And to fast forward to a future lecture, I should note that the Dutch won out in the end and managed to gain their independence from Spain. Note that the Spanish general is portrayed as behaving generously toward his opponent. The Spanish nobility was fiercely Catholic and fiercely proud, so this painting captures the way Velázquez's patron wanted to view his reign. The Dutch would have disagreed. The 80-year Spanish wars in the Netherlands were cruel even by the standards of the age of religious wars, where cruel warfare was rife. So this was Spain's last military success. The Dutch won it back just a few years later. Okay, this is one of the most famous paintings in art history. Sister Wendy, in a clip you're not going to see, calls it the greatest painting in her story of painting. Oddly enough, the painting didn't show up in any AP image-based questions from the last 16 years. I kept warning students I thought they were likely to. It did make the new list, so consider the warning reissued. So let's start with your reactions. Why was this painting such a big deal? I wish, of course, I'd had time to a chance to hear your answers, but I'm going to throw out a few more questions. Where is the light coming from? Well, if you look toward the middle of the painting, on the right, you see the Prime Minister of Spain, and by the way, Velázquez's paymaster. He's opening the door to let in light. But actually, art historians still debate about what's going on here. Are the king and queen watching Velázquez painted at his own easel paint their daughter? Is the princess looking out at her parents, reflected to us in the mirror? Or is she looking at us? Note the shout out to Jan van Eyck's Arnolfini marriage with the use of a mirror, which also was, of course, a way to showcase a painter's talent with light and images. So here are a couple of details from the painting. We see Velázquez wearing the mark of nobility that he hasn't actually managed to attain yet, though he will. It was actually painted on later. And the couple in the mirror are pretty clearly the king and queen. That chin is a dead giveaway. So are they included to make this a more complete family portrait? Because they're the subject of Velázquez's painting? Or maybe to suggest that Velázquez is almost a member of the royal family, privy to their most intimate moments? The little princess is clearly the painting's central figure. Note how she's bathed in an almost theatrical spotlight. But I think it's her dwarf maid of honor who's the emotional center of the painting. Velázquez has imbued her face with enormous dignity. This is a woman who has not let deformity defeat her. So, what do you notice about brushstrokes? Look especially at the little princess's sleeves. They're broad and easily visible. Remember that art historians use the term loose to describe this kind of brushstroke. The paint is actually laid on quite thickly in a technique you've encountered before. Remember the name? Impasto. So I don't know how much time you'll have, but I'm hoping that you will be able to close with this clip from an old but excellent series, Art of the Western World. You should recognize the fellow who's explaining Las Meninas to us, or at least you should recognize his voice. It's our friend Simon Schama, only he's a lot younger in this video. Well, I was a lot younger when I first saw this painting too. In our next lecture, we will continue with Spanish art, but the art of New Spain, or what we now call Latin America.